All right, so we're gonna jump right into it. Remember I was saying that my mix strategy is gonna be based on the kick as my sub activator and the bass guitar as more of a melodic slash rhythmical element. So not really concerned about how much sub is in that bass. And as you're about to hear, the bass plays up in a range where there isn't really too much sub. So I'll start there. I want to get it balanced. So let's take a look at how I processed both of them, starting with the kick. So on kick A, this is what it ended up as. And we have quite a bit of processing on the back end, meaning there's a lot of parallel compression. So I'm sending it to a DBX 160 for some transient attack. I'm sending it to my Acme Opticom, and I'm also sending it to a reverb. Now that may be against the law in some places. Not in my house. I send these kicks to reverbs, my babies. It's all good. So the reason why I'm doing that is because this song evokes like an 80s vibe to me, and 80s records, here you go, genre semiotics. 80s records had reverb on everything. So your kick, your snare, your vocals, your guitar, you know, your ocarina, if there was one in a record. So let's break it down. First plugin is this thing called Auto Align. It's not doing anything. It's the main kick. But what this kick does is it sends a signal to another kick drum sample, the second layer kick. Now, when you're layering your samples, you got to watch out for your phase, especially if it's in the low end. So what this plugin does is it will read one sample, and then the layer sample will adjust in phase and in timing in order to preserve the thickest frequency response possible. So just, you don't have to use this plugin. You can time align it, but that takes time. So the plugin really helps me out. The second is my friend, an SSL J channel EQ. I'm boosting some top end. I'm also reducing some of the beater attack in this one because it was a little abrasive. I'm adding some body at around 300 cycles, and of course I'm adding some sub because the kick is where I want my sub to live. Now I want to talk to you about this 300 cycle boost that I'm doing. Don't be so quick to cut your mid-range, because your mid-range across all different types of instruments, from drums to vocals, is your warmth and your body. Now, could it get boxy and annoying? Absolutely. Only cut it if it's boxy and annoying. Your boy had a problem in the beginning where I would just cut mid-range, cut mid-range, cut mid-range, and then my mixes would sound over-compressed. And because when you're over-compressing something, that is the frequency that leaves first. So it may give the illusion that you're over-compressing something, and you're actually not. You're just removing too much EQ. So that can make it hard to understand compression too. So really pay attention to that frequency area. If you feel like you want to cut it, boost it first, and then if it really rubs you the wrong way, then you know you're on the right path, cut it. But if you boost it and you're like, that's not so bad, leave it in, and maybe even mess around with boosting it because it will add to the body of your mix. So that's all I'm doing with the plugin. Let's turn this off and then turn it on again. So what we get from that, we get the articulation of the top end, which is that 80s sort of beater sound that really triggers that reverb. We get a little bit more body, and of course we get a little bit more sub. Now, I added a little bit of compression on this plugin here. As you can see when I play it, the compression lights are lighting up, and that is a tactic that I use with SSL plugins. I EQ into the compressor. So my compressor is post EQ. That's a typical sound of the genre in terms of like 80s-ish kicks. They would put the compressor in and they would EQ into the compressor really heavy-handedly. Typically, if this was a more traditional pop record or EDM record, I'm not going to compress this kick, but it added to the sound. So that's why I chose to do that. So that's the only processing on kick A. Let's move to kick B. Kick B has got a clipper on it, which adds a little bit more grit and it adds a little bit more top end and aggression. Then I have Parallel Aggressor by a great company, Baby Audio. This is adding just a little bit more harmonic distortion. I felt that this kick was lacking in the energy department, so this added it. This is a good example of sort of extreme processing that I don't typically do unless I need to either pull a sample in, and I won't do this, but in this case, I didn't want to resample a kick. I wanted to see if I can get this sound to work. So this is sort of parallel compression, all in one plug-in. You add some compression that they call spank. You add some harmonic distortion that they call heat. And then you blend it with the dry level. The other one is a little bit of slap delay because I'm borrowing from that 80s sound, and you would hear typically on some kind of like quasi-industrial or new wave 80s records, you would hear a little bit of slap on the kick. So I added a little bit of slap delay on the kick drum just to give it some groove. So I'm going to bypass all that processing now, and we'll turn everything on one by one. So that delay really took it from being this like insane aggressive, distorted club kick to something that added a little bit to the rhythmical element of the vibe, and actually, as you'll hear, complements the bass rhythm. So let's stack those two kicks now. And that's our kick. I want to show you the reverb that I'm sending the kick to. Kick A is being sent to a track called Collins that houses a plugin, which is an AMS RMX16 reverb module, like the nonlinear reverb that you would hear on that Phil Collins record, In the Air Tonight, when he does that, big famous drum roll. And if you put in Phil Collins's phone number in this plugin, he's going to come. He's going to bring you some pizza. So I'm not going to show you that now because he would cost too much money to have him on film. But anyway, it is a gated reverb. It's called nonlinear. And this is the kick without it. And the kick with it. It's not as extreme as 80s reverb, but it's enough for me to believe that the audience is going to get the illusion that I'm trying to make. So sometimes when you are doing some kind of like a reference to an era piece, subtlety is always, well, use your better judgment, but I would say subtlety is the best way to go. So I got my kick balance. Let's go over to the bass that's down here. The bass has quite a bit of processing. I start off with some really gentle EQ. It's cutting some of the mids. It's boosting the articulation. The reason why I'm cutting this mid-range here is because I felt that the kick drum really had enough of that to share to the bass. After that, we have a Neve 1084 boosting some of this lo-fi, gritty articulation that happens around 700 cycles on a bass guitar. It also sounds a little vintage. Then I have an insert, which is my RS124. It's a hardware compressor. It's the same compressor that I use in my vocal parallel, only it's set a little bit differently for compressing bass. That particular compressor was used iconically, well, not this specific one, but the compressor that Chandler modeled it after was used iconically in Abbey Road with Paul McCartney's bass sound. It's very thick and aggressive and punchy. So that's my bass compressor. We'll turn it on and off so you can hear what it's doing. The next plugin in my series of processing on the bass is a OG Pro Tools plugin, the Sans Amp. I love this plugin. Don't get caught up in whether or not you want to use a stock plugin. This is a stock plugin. It's been a stock plugin for such a long time. It sounds amazing. If something sounds good to you and it's a stock plugin, use it. If it don't sound good, don't use it, regardless if it's a stock or some kind of fancy plugin. Trust your ears. So with this plugin, I'm adding some kind of vintage growl. There's a note here that I leave for myself when I listen to the reference, or if I'm just going through the multi-tracks, and I could see here, it says remove sub, so we took care of that with some EQing. Get bass louder, this is what this plugin is doing. And talking heads. So what I'm saying to myself is that I do want like an era sound. I want a vintage 80s-ish bass. So that's helping me get that. Another final plugin that's going to help me, finish off that 80s-y sound is a chorus, because that's typically what you would hear on a bass, especially in like funk music from that era. So I add a little bit of chorus to the bass. Okay, let's listen to all the processing off and then all the processing on one by one. Okay, so it was at this point where I felt the tone was close enough and I wanted to then employ my outboard compressor. So let's hear now what this sounds like with the compressor out. I'm going to pause it and then I'm going to put the compressor in. And here's compressor in. I'm not mad at that. Now let's listen to the Sans amp in. And finally the chorus in. Bueno. So the only other thing that I'm adding to the processing is a little bit of parallel compression. And I'm sending it to what I'm calling a bass room to emulate the proximity effect that you would get if you were miking a bass cabinet, because this bass is actually DI. So I wanted to add a little bit of realism. The reverb that I'm using for my bass is this bathroom, because if a bathroom sounds good, you have to use it. Mix rule number 1. I could make a number 2 joke, but we're all adults here. So this is what the bass sounds like without any reverb. And then with the reverb. Now, adding reverb to low-end stuff, like I did in my kick and now in my bass, may be considered a no-no, but your boy makes his own rules. The lesson to be learned here is that if you feel like your motive justifies breaking some rules, then do it. You can always take that off and change the idea or just scrap it, right? Because we got computers. That's what we do with computers. Apple Z. So I needed to get a little bit more realism from an amp room. That's what we did. I think the bass sounds great. So let's listen to it now with the kick drum stacked on top of the bass. And we're going to check my VU meter, make sure I'm in the right spot, and we'll move on from there. So let's see. More. So look, we don't have that much sub in our bass guitar. That's fine. The kick is carrying that for it. They sound like they belong together, which is very important to me. And then the icing on the cake is that my VU meter is kind of moving around 0. It's a little bit above, but that's okay because this is an EDM record. EDM records are loud, and and I'm not afraid to go over 0, but it's right where I want it. Once I have that balance between my focus, let's get on to the rest of the mix.